and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Please enjoy the story you will hear today.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to Our People. Today, we're recording Holdeman History, Episode 3. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm here today with Dennis Goossen again. Welcome here, Dennis.
Thank you. Good to be back. Hi, everybody. Yes, today we're going to be covering the time period from 1940 through about 1970, 1969, just before the 1970s period. It's a complex period in the Holdeman Church's history. It's marked by the aftermath of 2 world wars, significant social and cultural changes, and internal tensions that challenged the Holdeman Church's foundational values. After World War II, the Holdeman Church found itself navigating a rapidly modernizing world. The tensions of this modern world caused some of the more conservative members to leave North America altogether. Some sought refuge in Brazil, where they could preserve a more traditional way of life. Meanwhile, back at home, you can see evidence of questions arising, liberalizing thoughts that were taking root within the church. The 1946 conference, you can already see evidence of, people were asking questions about the binding power of conference decisions, going through some of that stuff. This period also saw the church taking significant steps to retain its members. They published educational materials. They continued to institutionalize various church functions. They also expanded missions quite aggressively to places like Nigeria, India, and Haiti. However, these efforts also exposed the church to new ideas and cultures, which threatened the historic system that had defined the Holdeman way of life. So I want to go through a few different segments and just discuss them briefly. The first is expansion and liberalization. So statistics tell us that between the years 1947 and 1969, the Holdeman Church membership experienced substantial growth. Membership nearly doubled from 4,600 in 1947 to 8,800 in 1969. And the number of missionaries went from just 9 in 1947 to 111 missionaries out on the mission field in 1969. So this period of expansion brought the church into contact with diverse cultures through its missionary work in Nigeria, India, and Haiti, also on maybe on a slightly smaller scale within North America, in Alberta and in Arizona specifically, or primarily to the Native American populations. Returning missionaries and short-term volunteers came back to North America with new thoughts and ideas, and they began advocating for changes within the church. For instance, there was a lot of suggestion that the Holdemans should move to urban areas where they could be more effective in their missionary work. This was resisted. We'll go through a conference decision later that discussed exactly this issue. But it did lead to the establishment of mission churches in Dodge City, Kansas, or a mission church in Dodge City, Kansas, and other missionary outreaches into cities. So this did mark a significant shift from the church's traditional rural focus, and also a focus on reaching out to other Anabaptist communities. This was their first foray into actually reaching out to other cultures, other peoples. These changes are not without controversy. There was a democratization in the church. People were more willing to speak up. There's a decentralization of authority and power, and a lot of issues were reconsidered during this time period. The church's stance on higher education, business partnerships, involvement in civic society, being members on school boards, farm co-ops, things like that were all being challenged and discussed and talked about. There were some outsiders that were attracted to the simplicity of the Holdeman life, but at the same time, there were those within the church that were very concerned about the church losing ground. Next, I want to talk about leadership. So there were some significant leadership transitions during this time period. Significantly, within 4 years after the end of World War II, there were 8 prominent ministers that died during that time period. These would have been, the old guard post John Holdeman ministers, which left the figures that are probably still familiar to our listeners' ears. Frank Wenger, Harry Wenger, Reuben Kane were sort of the 3 leading ministers that guided the church through this turbulent time. New leadership structure. There was increased travel for revival meetings. As the world became more prosperous and air travel was popular and common. Ministers could travel around a lot more, so there's a lot of travel for revival meetings, including overseas travel. There were investigative trips around the world to Africa, Europe, India, Haiti, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, regions that would further influence the church's approach to mission work. However, these changes and the global perspective they brought also led to fragmentation within the church. As an example, there's a minister we're going to discuss a little bit more, J.E. Friesen, a minister from Montezuma who moved to California, who became known for his radically conservative views. He had strict lifestyle rules like not trimming beards, insisting on ankle-length skirts. He banned lawns around houses, drapes. Went to California and was known for some harsh excommunications in California, and finally culminated in a secession of members there, which leads us into our next section here. So I want to talk about some schisms and fragmentation. The post-war period was marked by several schisms within the Holdeman Church, which are, none of them resulted in large followings, but it does reveal some underlying issues and difficulties that the Holdeman Church was dealing with. So there's basically 2 patterns that were followed. There's a similar pattern of a small group that breaks away over disagreements like issues of worldliness, church programs, interpretation of certain doctrines, and then generally these movements petered out. None of them ever resulted in any long-term or major movements. One notable example, which I think is indicative, is C.M. Penner, my own great-grandfather, in fact, the son of leading minister Martin Penner. So C.M. Penner saw what he perceived as worldly decay within the church. He tried to speak out against it. He made a statement. He delivered a statement to the leaders at the 1950 conference. He was particularly opposed to public school, students attending public school, harmonized singing, lax avoidance practices and social events like birthday parties, family reunions, wedding receptions. He eventually withdrew from the church, but his following never grew beyond 5 members. So, he was well known because of his agitation and speaking out about a lot of things, but he really never gained much for a following. Something that was notable was his use of the candlestick argument, which 1 or 2 other cessation movements used the same candlestick argument, claiming that the church had lost its spiritual light and that he was now taking the candlestick, just like John Holdeman took the candlestick from the Mennonite Church. He was now continuing with that candlestick. So his movement eventually died out with his death. He died. His son took over leadership of his movement. And his son promptly excommunicated one of the other men that was in the movement. And his wife eventually died, and this last remaining son eventually actually rejoined the Holdeman Church. Jacob E. Friesen, the minister from Montezuma that I previously discussed, he was a minister from Montezuma who moved to California. He was known for his radically conservative views. Like I said, he, not trimming beards and mustaches, insisting on ankle-length skirts, banning lawn, banning fancy drapes. He did make an allowance for plain bare curtains for modesty's sake. He eventually led a secession of about 31 members, including a fellow minister, Ben Kane, from California in 1951 or 1952. But these groups also, his group also scattered and dissolved. So that was one common trend of, and there's a few other groups, Frank Miniger in Florida, Abe Decker in Kansas, Harvey Fricke in Ohio. They led small movements out of the Holdeman Church, primarily on the basis that the Holdeman Church was getting too worldly. Harvey Fricke was an interesting one. That's the son of Father F.C. Fricke. He was dissatisfied or disturbed with how how F.C. Fricke lost his bishop status. We discussed that in our last podcast, the whole movement to end the bishop system. So Harvey Fricke and F.C. Fricke both were quite annoyed at that whole thing. F.C. Fricke eventually kind of laid it down, quit arguing about it, quit fussing about it. But Harvey Fricke, he continued, and he broke with the church, took about 30 or 40 members with him in Pettisville, Ohio. There was another direction of movement, with just a few different trends. There was a movement in Alberta away from the Holdeman Church in the opposite direction to a more liberal view. Albert Taves was a minister in Swalwell, Alberta. He left the Holdeman Church to join the Mennonite Brethren there in Linden, Manitoba, or Linden, Alberta. Took several members with him. There were others in Alberta that joined Pentecostal churches. In Manitoba, there was a movement. Ernie Penner was the leader of that one, and they adopted the view of eternal security and have joined other existing churches. They never really had formed their own fellowship, but they joined other existing churches. So, and there were members in California too that moved over to the Church of God groups. So these movements, there were two trends. One trend, if people are leaving the Holdeman Church to more conservative groups, they generally tried to form their own group and eventually petered out. Some of them would rejoin the church. Other ones would just, end up living on their own, some conservative lifestyle. Others, those that left the Holdeman Church for a more liberal position, generally found their home in another existing church in the community. Some of them found leadership positions in those churches. Others just found their place within those churches. It does illustrate, though, a view of just this increasingly free-thinking view, that the ability to, hey, I can leave this church, I can go do something on my own. There's another section that I want to talk about. That is the socialization of youth and education issues. So as the world became, the church became increasingly integrated with the world, that became a real contentious issue within the Holdeman Church. So leaders spent a lot of time warning about trends. They were very, I was going through the Messenger of Truth today between 1940, 1970, and a lot of discussion about trends like skirt lengths, high heels, eyeshadow, makeup, boys with long hair, sports cars, mixed swimming, attending ball games. These were all things that were being listed as contentious issues. Tension surrounding education was really acute. Reuben Kane argued strongly for taking your children out of high school and educating them at home using correspondence courses. He himself educated himself in his high school year through correspondence courses through the mail. Ministers were arguing that the school environment was becoming too influential. It was shaping young people's opinions and lifestyles. This concern often came to the forefront during revival meetings. It wasn't uncommon that parents got excommunicated for allowing their children to remain in public school, even when these children were not yet church members. So it became a a real contentious issue. One
So
case in point. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Caleb.
public school was allowed, just not high school, right?
Right. So public school was allowed, but the revivalists would strongly encourage you take your children out after 8th grade or so. Like, yeah, once you get into high school, you don't do that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that was a contentious issue. You know, students often wanted to stay in. The parents were kind of, I don't want to take my student out, but then we get pressure. Some statistics in Lone Tree, Kansas, during the 1969 to 1970 school year, the congregation had 15 students in that high school graduation, like grade 12 level, but only 3 are actually listed as actually graduating from the local high school. The others had all dropped out due to pressure from revivalists. I wanted to deal with something else here, and I don't really see it mentioned anywhere, but let me jot down a note here to deal with this a little bit later. But I wanted to talk about the young men going to CPS, young men going to CPS units. Maybe I'll just mention that briefly right now, because it follows. So post 1940s, post World War II, the draft was a contentious issue, especially particularly in the United States. So young men were still being drafted, and the church had established or worked together with other Anabaptist churches to set up an alternative service units. And this had been happening throughout World War II, but the draft continued post World War II, and of course, into recent history of, there's the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and all these different wars. So it was continuing to be an issue, and so young men were going to these units, which were initially cooperative units with other Anabaptist groups, but transitioned gradually into the Holdeman Church running their own units. But this just continued this trend of the same thing we talked about with missionaries coming home and having new ideas, new ambitions. Let's move to the city, let's evangelize, let's reach out to people and introduce Christ to people. On a slightly different tack, or it went 2 different directions. But these young men that went to these units were also introduced to new ideas, new worlds, new ways of doing things. They were working in these university hospitals or university settings or medical settings, technical settings. They were being, usually in urban environments. This was a real concern to the leadership in the church, because they were seeing this, and they were seeing, okay, they're getting new ideas, they're being exposed to things. A lot of those young men were, of any segment of population, that's the segment that got the most excommunications while they were on their 2-year alternative service. A lot of it was just undisciplined living, immoral lifestyles. They went out drinking and smoking and partying and whatever, the things that weren't acceptable to the Holdemans. And honestly speaking, you can see writings of this, that a lot of the young men viewed this as, they were a little disinterested in going away and doing their time. It was viewed as sort of I've just got to go put in my time and put in my 2 years at these units. At the same time, it was viewed as, okay, I'm away from dad and mom, I'm out in the city, I can sort of live it up. And a lot of that happened. However, there were also, conscientious young men who saw the needs in society around them, and they came back with a lot of fervor for serving the Lord and doing good in the world around them, with a lot of these new ideas, bringing in more of an educational focus, bringing in innovative ideas of how to serve. And that also caused issues with these congregations. Once again, this just injection of new ideas into the church, which gave consternation to the leaders. Shall we adopt the new ideas, or do we not adopt the new ideas? Which brings me into another segment, which is a discussion on excommunication, because this became a central aspect of Holdeman Church life. It has always been a central aspect of Holdeman life, but its frequency, the frequency of excommunication, really became notable during this time period from 1940 through 1970. Harry Wanger estimates that in the United States, 1 out of every 5 or 6 members experiences excommunication at some point during their church membership. In Canada, it was slightly less frequent. He estimated 1 out of every 9 or 10 faced excommunication. But when you go to mission settings like Mexico or Nigeria, it was 2 out of every 3 members that were excommunicated at some point in their lives. Now,
so how did that
yeah.
work with being in the unit? Did they have to go home, or did they just keep serving there even though they were excommunicated?
It was a mixed bag. Most of them continued serving because, remember, this was their alternative to military service. So if they quit serving there, they lose their exempt status and ended up, they would end up having to deal with that somehow with the draft board and either, enlist in the military or they'd have to enlist in the military if they're not serving as a conscientious objector. So I didn't delve into this too much, but there was definitely a system and a committee set up to monitor, quote unquote, our boys, in all their different camps and units around the country. Ministers were traveling to these places, trying to exercise some pastoral care and excommunicating and reaccepting and so forth while they were in the unit serving. Something that is notable is that at least 75% of those that are excommunicated eventually come back into the Holdeman Church. So the excommunication process is generally not a net loss for the Holdeman Church, because these people are coming back into the Holdeman Church. However, it still had its challenges. So the people that were excommunicated and remained that way for significant amounts of time, different to the ministers, Harry Wanger and some of the others that were interviewed, they mentioned this, that those that were excommunicated, the impact is pretty severe. Social isolation because of the avoidance, the ban, there was increased incidence of alcoholism, immoral lifestyle, emotional illness, mental disorders among the excommunicated individuals, specifically those with multi-generational Holdeman ancestry. So those that had joined the church from outside who then left later, they didn't have these problems. But those that, had like 3 or 4 generations of Holdeman family and were then excommunicated, they went through significant personal challenges when that happened. And like I said, at least 75% of them eventually come back into the Holdeman Church. I wanted to work my way through some of the conference decisions and ministers' meetings that happened during this time period, which was notably pretty frequent during this time period. For a while there, they were having the conferences every 3 years. They later extended that to 5 years. But they went through a lot of, numerous conferences, and I have some of the ministers' minutes from that time period too. But a couple of interesting points. One is the quote unquote the drift, which is a term used to describe the movement to worldliness. First was mentioned in the 1950 conference. The 1950 conference, they were dealing with the drift. How do we address the drift? And I know that's still being discussed today. So that's been 75 years of dealing with the drift. It's a recurring theme. What's that?
Still looking for solutions.
Still looking for solutions to the drift. Although the recent verbiage I've been hearing on it is that the drift is just simply a permanent problem with the church. It's an inevitable problem because of the outside force of the world. So anyway, it's a recurring theme in the Holdeman Church's struggle to maintain traditional values in a changing world. Another topic that's notable because it's discussed at least one out of every 2 conferences is the women's head covering. It comes up repeatedly during this time period and even after. We'll deal with that later, but it comes up with decisions, reaffirmations being made. It indicates how central the head covering is to the church's identity, that this is something that needs to get dealt with on a regular basis. There were discussions about the size. There were discussions about the form, the style of it. Basically, generally just reaffirming, okay, that decision that we made, just reminding you all that decision still stands. We need to keep on with this decision. Which that indicates too that you can read between the lines and see, okay, the reason that they're having these discussions is because it's an issue. People are, the women are maybe not wearing their head coverings, or they're wearing it in a form that's not approved or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, the 1956 conference is an interesting conference because it marks a turning point with various, accounted at least 4 different decisions that were repealed in the 1956 conference. So that was like a liberalizing conference. There was a ban on harmonized singing that was allowed, that was repealed. So now you're allowed to sing alto and tenor and bass. And together with that ban, they also now did not ban choir singing at funerals and weddings at post-1956. There was also, there's a couple others, and I don't have them in my notes. Let me quickly pull that up. In 1956, there was a couple other things that were opened up during that time period. Lightning rods. The ban on lightning rods was repealed. Maybe that was the only other one, because recorded sound and photography were still banned. So yeah, those three things were repealed. So 3 things repealed, and then photography cameras and recorders were still being banned. Let's see, 1959, the phrase modesty, simplicity, and economy was first coined. That's become a key principle in the Holdeman Church's language. That phrase encapsulates the Holdeman Church's values. It served as a benchmark going forward for everything from clothing to technology. That's the phrase that gets battered around: modesty, simplicity, economy. The ministers' meetings are a little bit more revealing than the conference decisions, because you see discussions of things that that the general public are not necessarily privy to. So, for example, in the 1968 ministers' meeting, hold on, that wasn't the 1968. I think that was the 1951. Yeah, so in the 1951 meeting, there was discussion about the quote-unquote the Abe Decker condition. So how do we handle the Abe Decker condition? And it was agreed to leave it to the Church Problems Committee. But that's telling, because we discussed the Abe Decker secession movement in Kansas earlier. They also spent a lot of time discussing sex education in the public schools, and put together a petition to present to the Kansas Board of Education to keep sex education out of the public schools, or at least to allow their children, to not attend the sex education classes. And they discussed birth control, which went through actually several iterations before they finally came up with a writing. In 1968, there was a question about birth control, and it was appointed to a study committee to study the issue of birth control, and and get into that. Clifford Penner, Harry Wanger, Milford Wanger, Dave Ratzlaff were on that one. And
this would also,
yeah,
this would reflect changes in the outside culture, because hadn't the pill just become popular or just been invented? And so there's also all of the changes that are happening in the 60s with the hippies and so on. And so
yeah, that's exactly right. So there was, like, this was a new technology. There's a new technology. The pill, the contraceptive pill, is now available, and so what shall we do with it? So there's a study committee that got issued or that got set up to study it. And in the end, I'm just trying to find the statement that they made in it. Finally, in 1970, they made a statement on family planning, in which they did not mention the pill at all. Basically, they said that, when you get married, you should be ready to accept the responsibilities of a family. If you do want to plan your family, they recommend the natural rhythm method or the abstinence method as the most scriptural method. And when that doesn't work, then you need to seek a doctor's advice and the minister's advice. So if natural family planning is not working for you, you have to consult the minister and the doctor. Let's just see here. Yeah, that's basically it. And to their credit, they specifically say they do not suggest that a couple should refrain from all sexual relationships. They recognize that was an essential part of a happy marriage. Let's see. They also discussed drifting congregations as a recurring concern, especially getting into 1969 and 1970. The ministers' minutes begin discussing drifting congregations, although they don't name any congregations. But what they're saying is they're identifying that a congregation drifts. It often as a result of an evil spirit in the congregation that gets established in the congregation and precedes outward signs of drift. And the outward signs of drift are adoption of worldly lifestyles, dealing with sports cars, short dresses, and long hair among the brethren. And somewhere also I did notice that they discussed there were some congregations that were sitting together, men and women together in their benches instead of separate, and that was a significant concern. One congregation that was discussed as a specific issue is the Hartville, Ohio congregation, which dissolved in 1977. Many of their members moving to Homeworth, Ohio. But this was a congregation that really went more legalistic and strict. Several of them moved to Brazil. There was a minister, Daniel Kramer, who later he remained a member, but he lost his minister position because of being too legalistic and strict. I was going to deal with, I think I missed a section here that I was going to deal with, but oh, there it is. Okay. So institutional growth. There were internal challenges, but the Holdeman Church was also focused on expanding its institutions and financial strategies. So a couple things that happened during this time period. First of all, the church started publishing works. They translated the Mirror of Truth into English. They published, different diaries and journals from missionaries, and began to push them out over the conference. Book agents were established in all the different congregations, and they were supposed to promote and order in these books and try to sell these books, which was the strengthening of it. It's a reaction to the outside forces coming in. So they've got all these new ideas coming in. And so the reaction to that was, okay, we're going to write our own books, write our own doctrinal works, our own Bible study works to, in a sense, push back against these new ideas coming in, strengthen the institution. The church also started establishing senior care homes and hospitals, Mercy Hospital, Bethel Home, Grace Nursing Home, Maplewood Manor or Greenland Home back up in Canada, which eventually ceased to exist, and Maplewood Manor and Steinbach took that over. There's also by 1969, the bare beginnings of an educational system starting to happen. There was 3 schools existing in 1969 in Ohio, Georgia, and Kansas. And the Mennonite Union Aid and Brotherhood Auto Aid, and I don't know if the CHA had started by that point or not, but establishing their own financial institutions, really the insurance institutions, although they insist they're not insurance, but this, just trying to do these things for people, provide these things for their people, so that they don't have to reach outside the walls of the church for these things. I wanted to mention a couple interesting highlights or anecdotes from the Messenger of Truth, and I just grabbed two of them. There's a lot of stuff to wade through and a lot of different stories, but these are the two stories that I have here. Are they're really representative samples of what I read. So there's one, Brother Herman Becker. He writes a very poignant, touching story about his wife and how she struggled with a wristwatch that she had. She had this fancy wristwatch, beautiful wristwatch, which was from Herman. But she finally felt like the Spirit was telling her it was too worldly, it was displeasing to God, and so she got rid of this watch, and how happy she felt and how free she felt and how, she could just surrender and leave that. So that underscores this whole strict control on material possessions and this belief that even a little item that you own could detract from your spiritual life. And the other story was very similar to it. A lady had bought these fancy curtains, and she liked them. They were beautiful. They beautified her house, and yet she just felt so guilty about them eventually. And so she ended up throwing them away. She was overcome with guilt during prayer. She was trying to pray, and these curtains were still hanging in her living room, and she had to get up from prayer and take those curtains off the wall and throw them out. And then again, she felt happy. She felt at peace. She was relaxed. She could, she had surrendered. So it illustrates this intense pressure to conform and this intense fear of excommunication. And then the release and the peace and the happiness that comes when you conform. And you're no longer afraid of being excommunicated. You're no longer afraid of hellfire, really. So these are the kinds of stories that are written in the Messenger of Truth, which is the official church paper. So these are the kind of stories that the editor is trying to put out there to remind everybody that, look at your possessions, look at what you're doing, look at the things that you own, and be very careful. Get rid of them if they're hindering you. Maybe you need to feel guilty about something in your life. So there's this real push, and you see that throughout the Messenger of Truth.
So you might have to, you might have to remind me, but there wasn't there also a minister's decision around this time? I think maybe in the 50s, where they decided that a person would have to be excommunicated even though they had repented.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. So that was in, let me just see if I can find it here. I'm going to look it up, but that you mentioned, that came up, that was decided in at the end of the 1970s, in 1978. So sorry, I'm just kind of frantically flipping through my papers here to find out where it was. In 1968. I'll keep looking for it. But no, so in 1968 or 1969, this was discussed and decided that if you repented while you were still in the church, if you repented and God granted forgiveness, while you're still in the church, you do not need to be excommunicated. Here we go. In 1951, after the Church Problems Committee presented a brief outline of existing problems and conditions, an instructive discussion followed, and the following resolution was unanimously approved. A, when sins unto death are revealed and no true repentance is manifest, such a one should be excommunicated without previous admonition. So that's when a sin is revealed, a quote-unquote death sin is revealed, and no repentance is manifest. B, where there is doubt as to true repentance, we will give the transgressor the advantage of our doubts, yet with the reserve that the future shall decide. So if there's doubt about the true repentance, we give some time. And then C, in whom we can see and believe true repentance has taken place and God has forgiven, we should forgive without excommunication. Okay, so that's in 1951.
And that
This
actually
decision, yeah,
that
go
actually,
ahead.
if I remember correctly, that would reflect John Holdeman's position, right?
I believe so. That decision was repealed in 1978. So we'll deal with that when we talk about the 1970s. But in 1978, the decision was changed so that if there was a death sin in the church, and whether or not repentance had occurred and whether or not God had forgiven, that thing needed to be excommunicated to, quote unquote, carry the sin outside the church. So yeah, in closing, or we can discuss more here, but my summary was that this time period was significant growth and internal tension for the Holdeman Church. Membership doubled, nearly doubled, missions were expanded, new institutions were established, but there were serious internal conflicts, many members defecting, others grappling with this increasingly rigid stance on education, excommunication. The church found itself walking in this tightrope. It was trying to balance this isolationist tendency of living in these rural communities, living this strict lifestyle, with this evangelistic outreach of reaching out to the world, reaching out into these other countries and so forth. The outreach efforts in North America were often, it was limited to sending missionaries to cities and Indian reservations with really quite limited success. But existing congregations and new rural congregations were thriving. There was increased youth activities, institutional activities, youth programs, missionary program. Missionaries would come back and bring reports and so forth. So in many ways, this period represented a golden age for the Holdeman Church. This is really the time of the fastest growth in the church, probably the most consistent growth in the church. A lot of what we would think of today as these ordinary parts of life in the Holdeman Church, they started during this time period. Youth programs, nursing homes, tract meetings and missionary reports and all these things that happened during this time period. So this really was, I would say, the golden age for the Holdeman Church. But it also there's fraught with challenges which hinted at future shakeups. So Clarence Hebert ends his book saying that in 1970 he could see, and he issued his book in 1970, I think, and he could see another major transition on the horizon already. He was seeing polarizing leadership, dividing one way or the other way, either towards more, either to the left or the right, really, into more fundamentalist, legalistic, strict control versus more of this, what you might call like a normal church stance of, focusing on grace and Christ and not focusing too much on lifestyle. So there's this polarizing happening in the leadership, and
more
different
integrated.
and more integrated with the world around you. And then these historic emphases are being questioned, like the belief in the one true church is being questioned. You can see this in some of the discussions in the conference book, like decisions and reaffirmations of, yes, this is the one true church. Traditional methods of church discipline were being questioned. So the church really was standing on the cusp of another significant upheaval in 19. Then this was very prescient to Clarence Hebert, because we see exactly, we'll discuss this in our next podcast, what exactly happened in the 1970s. But yeah, this was really a golden period for the Holdeman Church. Yeah, that's what I have, Caleb. If you have questions or something that you think I missed, we can discuss that now.
The only thing I'm thinking of is that there was also people, I think this would have been in the 60s, moving to Brazil in an attempt to form a more conservative movement within the Holdemans.
Yes.
Or was that later on?
No, that was in the 1960s. And I have an interesting discussion in one of the ministers' meetings about Brazil. So the move to Brazil was primarily to escape the worldly, well, two things: to escape the worldly North America, but also to escape what they saw as the increasingly worldly church. So the Holdeman Church was drifting, was losing it. This was one of the secession movements that was happening, but it was within the church. It was kind of quasi with the blessing of the Holdeman Church. But yeah, in 1970, there was a discussion at the Ministers and Deacons Council. There was an idea that some of those that had moved in 1968. So in 1968, there was a decision that those that wanted to move to Brazil should do this with counsel from their ministership. And some of them had not done so. And then in Brazil, there was a little bit of a rift, even among the families that were there. And so in 1970, it was urged that under the present existing conditions, no further moves to Brazil shall be made. So there was sort of a pause put on the move to Brazil right then in 1970. So yeah, it was definitely that was kind of the move. I think the move to Mexico had been made a little bit earlier, but yeah, the Brazil move, which was to get away from the liberal North American church and liberal North American society at large, was made. Yeah, it was an interesting time period. Let me just look at something else here that I might want to discuss. Yeah, just here's another interesting thing that I could mention, and that is that it seemed like there was quite an acceptance of photography, because I've got, from various sources, I've got quite a number of photographs of families posing for photographs in the newspaper, in history books. Like there's a history of the town of Winton, and the Holdeman people are there. Like I'm just looking here at Holdeman girls, 1950, a picture of 7 youth girls all dressed up nicely and posing for the camera. Things that were, I was raised and taught, you don't pose for pictures. That's not what our people do. But clearly in the 1950s and 60s, that was not an issue, at least in certain places.
A lot of these changes too, they're changes that are happening in, the mainstream society. That period of change, that period of change was a period for everyone, right? It wasn't.
That's right. I mean, that was just, in general, that was a free thinking, free living time. Like lots of new ideas and innovative ideas were in society during that time period. So, some of that just worked its way inside the Holdeman Church, which is a pretty common thing with any segment of society.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's everything I have. Hopefully that gives us enough material to keep our listeners interested and hooked in until we hit the 1970s.
Towards the end of his book, he talks about a pendulum swing in the church. So
yeah,
sort of going back and forth from, I guess, more conservative. And so now in this period we're in, we're sort of swung over to the liberal side. And
yeah,
the next episode we'll talk about the swing in the other direction.
Yeah, and I should just, here's one thing I could mention. I don't have any, source material to point this to, but I just know from discussions with my parents, with my grandparents, with other people from that time period that, like many of them would have supported the, the harsh crackdowns in the 1970s, and their explanation generally was that the church was quote unquote too worldly in the 1960s. Lots of things were allowed, like we talked about, sports cars and miniskirts and lots of these quote unquote worldly things were happening. I had one person suggest that there was, a fair bit of, people were getting televisions in their homes and all sorts of things. So yeah, it definitely was a swing to the liberal side that came crashing to a halt in the 1970s.
All right. Well, I think we covered it. I don't know if I
Right.
have anything to add.
Nope, I don't have anything else. Good to talk to you, Caleb.
All righty. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.